You were taught that the story of the first Americans has a simple shape: a bridge, a line of hunters, a walk south into an empty continent. The ground itself disagrees. Buried in the gypsum flats of New Mexico are footprints left by children who ran along the shore of a lake that no longer exists, at a moment when, according to the old textbook version of this story, no human being was supposed to be there at all. And somewhere off the coast of Alaska and British Columbia, underwater that has risen more than 90 meters since the last ice age, lies what may be the actual road the first Americans walked, a road we can no longer see because the ocean swallowed it. So here is the real question this journey has to answer. When and by which paths did the first peoples actually reach the Americas? And why do footprints, ancient genomes, and drowned coastlines keep forcing scientists to tear up the map and start again? Before we go further, if deep-time mysteries like this one are the kind of thing you want more of, this is a good moment to subscribe, because the story only gets stranger from here, and we are just getting to the ocean. To understand how any of this became possible, we have to go back even further than Beringia itself, back to a river valley in northern Siberia called Yana, well above the Arctic Circle, where archaeologists have found evidence of human occupation dating to roughly 32,000 to 27,000 years ago. That date matters enormously because it means humans had already learned to survive brutal, high-latitude cold, building shelters, working mammoth ivory into tools and weapons, hunting large Arctic game thousands of years before anyone stood at the threshold of the Americas. The people who eventually moved into Beringia were not stepping into the unknown as fragile newcomers to the cold. They were carrying generations of Arctic survival knowledge with them, refined at places like Yana long before Beringia even existed as a habitable landmass in its current form. Keep this in mind, because everything that follows only makes sense once you understand that the peopling of the Americas was not humanity's first encounter with extreme cold. It was one chapter in a much longer relationship with it. Start by doing something no ship or satellite can do: drain the Pacific and the Bering Sea by roughly 100 meters. Not metaphorically. This actually happened during the coldest stretch of the last glaciation, when so much of the planet's water was locked into continental ice sheets that global sea level fell by at least 90 meters, and by some reconstructions closer to 120. Watch what surfaces, where a narrow, storm-tossed strait exists today, a vast plain appears instead, stretching from the Lena River in Siberia to the Mackenzie River in what is now Canada. This was Beringia, not a thin causeway, not a land bridge in the sense of some delicate walkway over a chasm, but a subcontinent of dry steppe and tundra in places wider than the distance across several modern countries combined. This was not the frozen, lifeless wasteland the word Ice Age tends to conjure in our minds. It was a cold, dry, productive grassland, sometimes called the Mammoth Steppe, where deep-rooted grasses and herbs thrived precisely because the climate was too dry and too wind-scoured for heavy snow to bury them. That single ecological detail changed everything about who could live there. Herds of woolly mammoth moved across it. So did wild horses, steppe bison, saiga antelope, and the occasional wandering steppe lion, in numbers that, viewed from above, would have looked less like a frozen frontier and more like the plains of Africa reimagined in Ice Age color. And people lived on it, not merely crossed it, but inhabited it, for what genetic evidence suggests may have been thousands of years, hunting, gathering, raising children, on ground that today lies dark and silent under the Bering and Chukchi seas. That single fact should already unsettle the old idea of a crossing. Beringia was not an obstacle between two worlds. For a long stretch of the Ice Age, it was the world, a homeland in its own right, connected as easily to Asia as to North America, or perhaps not clearly divided between the two at all. So, if a landmass this immense lay open, why didn't people simply walk south the moment they arrived? The answer to that question is written in ice, and it is where the story gets its first real obstacle. Because getting into Alaska was never the same as getting into the rest of North America. Stand at the eastern edge of Beringia during the depths of the last glaciation and look south, and what you would have seen was not open plain, but a wall, in fact, two walls. The Laurentide ice sheet, an almost continental mass of ice centered over what is now Hudson Bay, pressed westward. The Cordilleran ice sheet, born in the mountains of British Columbia, and the Alaska Panhandle, pressed east. Where they met, somewhere along the eastern flank of the Rockies, they fused into a corridor shaper's nightmare. Thousands of kilometers of ice, in places kilometers thick, sealing the interior of the continent almost completely. Geological evidence indicates this barrier held firm for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, roughly from 26,000 years ago, until somewhere near 14,000 years ago. For most of that span, arriving in Alaska did not mean arriving in the Americas. It meant arriving at the edge of a second continent's worth of ice, with no interior door yet open. Imagine walking for weeks across open Beringian grassland, only to reach a horizon that simply stops being passable. Not a mountain range you might eventually cross, not a river you might eventually ford, but a wall of compressed ice standing in places kilometers high, running for thousands of kilometers in either direction with no visible end. That is what generations of Beringian families would have faced if they pushed east and south too early. The interior of North America was, quite literally, off the map. So picture the choice facing the earliest Beringian populations. Wait, on a plain that was itself changing season by season, or find another way around, not through the middle of the continent, but along its edge. This is where the investigation turns toward the coast, and toward one of the strangest problems in all of archaeology. How do you find evidence for people who may have walked along a shoreline that isn't there anymore? Picture a narrow corridor of open, ice-free ground running down the Pacific edge of the continent, threaded between the western face of the Cordilleran ice and the sea. Coves rich with shellfish, kelp forests thick with fish, seals and seabirds, in numbers a hungry traveler could hardly miss. Many researchers now consider this coastal route at least as plausible as any interior path, maybe more so, because it would have stayed biologically usable even while the continent's interior sat locked under ice. There is a catch, though, and it is not a small one. Global sea level at the height of the glaciation was so much lower than it is today that the shorelines those early travelers would have walked no longer exist above water. As the ice melted and the oceans rose again, the beaches, river mouths, and campsites of a Pacific coastal migration were submerged, some by tens of meters, buried under sediment, reworked by thousands of years of waves. We are not missing this evidence because it never existed. We are missing it because the sea erased the pages. Some researchers describe this hypothetical route as a kelp highway, a nearly unbroken chain of coastal ecosystems running from Japan and Kamchatka along the Aleutians and down the Pacific edge of North America, each one rich enough in fish, shellfish, and marine mammals to support small groups moving steadily southward without ever needing to cross open, empty terrain. It's an elegant idea, and much of the underlying ecology checks out. What it would have required, though, some form of watercraft. Rafts or boats capable of navigating cold coastal waters and crossing occasional stretches of open sea. And boats, unlike stone points, essentially never survive tens of thousands of years in the archaeological record. Wood rots, hide and sinew decay. So this part of the story rests on inference rather than a preserved hull sitting in a museum case, a reasonable evidence-consistent hypothesis, not a proven fact, and archaeologists are careful to say so. And even the interior route, once the ice finally began to retreat, was not simply open the moment a path appeared. Researchers studying ancient environmental DNA preserved in the sediments of the so-called ice-free corridor have found something telling. The biological resources needed to actually survive a journey through that corridor, plants, animals, drinkable water along the route, did not become available until around 12,600 years ago, which means any group already living south of the ice sheets before that date could not have used the interior corridor to get there. They had to have arrived some other way, and earlier. So the coast stops looking like an alternate theory for enthusiasts and starts looking like something close to a necessity. Here is where the case stops being only about ice sheets and ocean currents and becomes about people. Because if humans were south of the glaciers before the interior corridor could sustain life, then somewhere evidence of their footsteps should still exist. And it does. In the gypsum dune fields of what is now White Sands National Park, New Mexico, along the ancient shoreline of a vanished body of water archaeologists call Lake Otero, researchers have uncovered human footprints dated to between roughly 23,000 and 21,000 years ago. Read that again slowly, because the number is doing a lot of work. That places people south of the great ice sheets during the last glacial maximum itself, the very coldest, driest peak of the Ice Age, many thousands of years before the culture long taught as the first Americans even existed. Naturally, a date this old and this disruptive did not go unquestioned, and it shouldn't have. Extraordinary claims call for extraordinary scrutiny, and the White Sands footprints got it. Scientists tested the age using 3 independent methods that have almost nothing in common with each other. Radiocarbon dating of the seeds of an aquatic plant embedded in the same sediment layers as the footprints gave one estimate. Radiocarbon dating of ancient pollen grains, extracted separately and analyzed to sidestep concerns about aquatic plants absorbing old carbon from the water itself, gave a second independent estimate. Luminescence dating, a technique that measures how long buried quartz grains have sat in the dark since they last saw sunlight, gave a third. All 3 converged on the same window, roughly 23,000 to 21,000 years before the present. When 3 different clocks, built on 3 different physical processes, tell you the same time, that is not a coincidence anyone can wave away easily. It is about as strong a confirmation as archaeology gets. And these are not a single isolated set of prints either, which matters because a single footprint could be an anomaly, but a landscape isn't. Excavations at White Sands have revealed more than 20 separate sedimentary horizons containing tracks, layered through more than 3 meters of ancient lakeshore deposits. That is not one crossing on one afternoon. That is a place people return to again and again over a long span of time. A landscape woven into the rhythm of their lives. So who left them, and what were they doing there? The trackways tell a story more intimate than any spear point ever could. Alongside adult footprints are the smaller, unmistakable prints of adolescents and children. In places, it looks as though a young person was carrying a smaller child on one hip, judging from the uneven, weighted stride pattern preserved in the mud. Whole family groups moved across this wetland, not as pioneers on some symbolic first crossing, but as people living ordinary lives on a landscape they clearly knew well. And they were not alone on it. Tracks of Columbian mammoth cross and overlap with human trails. So do the tracks of Harlan's giant ground sloth, an animal that stood taller than a grown man on its hind legs, powerful enough to fell a human being with a single swipe of its claws, and, judging from one remarkable trackway, appears to have paused mid-stride, reared, and turned to face a group of humans following close behind, before eventually moving on. Whether that moment was a hunt, a standoff, or simple mutual wariness between two very different animals sharing the same shoreline, no one can say with certainty. But the tracks preserve the tension of it regardless, frozen in sediment for over 20,000 years. Camels, ancient horses, giant bison, dire wolves, the full strange cast of Ice Age North America, shared this wetland with the people whose children's footprints are still legible in stone today. Picture it for a moment. Cold wind off a shallow lake, mammoth herds moving along the far shore, children running ahead of the adults through wet mud that would, by pure accident, outlast every one of them by more than 20,000 years. And what about the animals themselves? Did the arrival of skilled human hunters onto a continent full of unwary giants help drive species like the mammoth, the ground sloth, and the giant bison to extinction? It's tempting to reach for a single tidy villain, but researchers who study this question carefully tend to resist that urge. The honest, evidence-based answer is that the weight of hunting pressure versus climate change in these extinctions appears to vary by species and by region. Some populations were likely squeezed primarily by a rapidly warming, shifting climate. Others may have faced a genuine 1-2 combination of environmental stress and new human predators arriving at the worst possible moment. There isn't yet a single, uniform verdict that applies to every species across 2 continents, and researchers are honest about that uncertainty rather than papering over it. None of this, not the footprint dates, not the genomic timelines, not the disputed sites, comes from a single authority handing down a verdict. It comes from archaeologists, geochronologists, and geneticists working with entirely different kinds of evidence and routinely disagreeing with each other. A geochronologist's luminescence date can undercut an archaeologist's stratigraphic argument. A geneticist's population model can force both of the others to reconsider a migration route they'd assumed was settled. That friction is not a weakness in the science. It's the actual mechanism by which a claim as old and disruptive as white sands earns its credibility. By surviving attack from 3 directions instead of just one. If evidence this concrete exists for a single wetland in New Mexico, how fast could people have actually spread once they were free to move across an entire continent? That is the next thread this investigation has to pull. Before we go there, a quick pause. If this kind of evidence-driven detective work is landing for you, a like genuinely helps more people find this video, and there is a lot more ground still to cover. The story ancient genomes tell is, in some ways, even more dramatic than the footprints. because DNA lets researchers trace not just where people were, but how populations moved, split, and reconnected across thousands of years. One especially striking discovery involves a genetically distinct population researchers now call the ancient Beringians, documented from remains found in Alaska. Their genetic signature diverged from other early Native American ancestors while still in the Beringian region, suggesting Beringia functioned not as an empty way station people rushed through, but as a homeland where a population could settle, differentiate, and persist for a substantial stretch of time before some of their relatives ever moved south. Genetic reconstructions place this period of isolation and differentiation somewhere in the range of 25,000 to 20,000 years ago, meaning the ancestors of every indigenous nation from Alaska to the tip of South America spent thousands of years as a single, relatively isolated population, likely somewhere in or near Beringia, before that population's descendants ever set foot south of the ice. Once population groups did cross south of the ice, the genomic record shows something that looks less like a single disciplined migration and more like an explosion, a rapid, branching expansion that fanned out across two continents, followed by long stretches of regional isolation, later episodes of mixing between groups, and deep continuity in many regions across roughly 15,000 years. There was no single, uniform, first American culture that stayed the same from Alaska to Patagonia. There was diversification almost from the very beginning. Different groups adapting to deserts, forests, coastlines, and mountains in their own ways, on their own timelines. And here is a fact that carries real weight beyond the science itself. With the exception of populations that arrived later and settled specifically in Arctic regions, the ancient individuals whose genomes have been studied across the Americas are more closely related to living indigenous peoples of the Americas today than to any population outside the continent. That is not a minor technical footnote. It means the deep genetic story and the living, present-day story are the same story, unbroken across roughly 20,000 years. For decades, popular history collapsed this entire, sprawling, branching migration into a single word, Clovis. Named for a site in New Mexico, the Clovis culture is famous for its beautifully crafted, fluted stone spear points, engineered with a groove at the base that let them be seated efficiently into a wooden shaft. A genuine technological achievement, and one that spread with startling speed across much of what is now the continental United States roughly 13,000 years ago. An area spanning thousands of kilometers, colonized by a shared toolkit within a time frame that, geologically speaking, is barely more than an eye blink. For a long time, Clovis first was treated less like a hypothesis and more like an article of faith in American archaeology. But the White Sands footprints predate Clovis technology by roughly 8 to 10,000 years. The genomic evidence for early branching and expansion predates it too. Clovis was not the opening chapter of human presence in the Americas. It was a remarkable, widespread technological horizon that appeared many thousands of years into a story that had already been unfolding for a very long time. The people who made those elegant fluted points were skilled, successful, and historically significant. But they were latecomers to a continent that had already been home to human beings for millennia. If Clovis wasn't first, then the search for what actually was first has kept archaeologists busy and occasionally at odds with each other for years, because dating a very old site correctly is genuinely difficult, and every claim invites intense scrutiny. Consider a river valley in what is now western Idaho, a place the Nimiopu, the Nez Perce people, have long called Nipehe, an ancestral village site woven into their own oral history long before it carried any archaeological label. Excavations there at what researchers have named Cooper's Ferry uncovered evidence of human occupation dated to roughly 16,000 years ago, a location well inland, and notably, one that predates the point at which the interior ice-free corridor could have biologically sustained travelers. That timing matters enormously. If people were already living at Nipe before the interior corridor was viable, the most coherent explanation is that their ancestors arrived by a different route entirely. Very likely the Pacific coast, followed inland along river systems that connect the coastline to the interior northwest. One inland valley, in other words, helps confirm a coastal story that the ocean itself has mostly erased. Further south, in Chile, sits a site that has functioned for decades as one of archaeology's most important stress tests, Monte Verde. For a long time, its classic occupation layer, dated to roughly 14,500 years ago, stood as one of the strongest pieces of evidence that people were south of the ice sheets well before Clovis, a finding that, when it was first proposed, faced years of fierce resistance before eventually winning wide acceptance, and the story is not finished being tested even now. In 2026, a new geomorphological analysis challenged that classic dating, proposing a much younger age for the site's key deposits, a claim that other researchers have pushed back against hard, defending the original stratigraphic interpretation. As of now, that debate remains genuinely open, which is, in its own way, exactly the point. Monte Verde is not a cautionary tale about scientists getting it wrong. It's a demonstration of how this field actually works. Claims get proposed, get tested against the physical evidence again and again, and only survive if they hold up under real pressure. The chronology of the first Americans is not a settled monument carved in stone somewhere in a museum. It is a living argument, still being fought out in sediment layers and journal pages in real time this year. And whichever way the Monte Verde debate ultimately resolves, the broader picture built from White Sands, Nipehe, and the genomic record will still stand. So who gets to tell this story when the evidence keeps changing and the people it's about are not a vanished mystery, but living nations? This may be the most important course correction of all. The old framing treated the peopling of the Americas as a story about arrival into emptiness, as though two entire continents sat waiting, blank and unclaimed, until someone finally showed up to begin their history. The genetic and archaeological record says the opposite. It says continuity. It says the population that first spread across Beringia and south of the ice sheets is, with only later exceptions in the Arctic, directly ancestral to the hundreds of indigenous nations living across the Americas today. Nations with their own place names, their own oral traditions about ancestral villages like Nipehe, their own long relationship with these landscapes that predates any archaeological survey by thousands of years. Science did not discover this history from nothing. It has been slowly and often imperfectly catching up to knowledge that was never actually lost. So what do we actually have when all of this is put together? Not a bridge and a walk south, a homeland in Beringia inhabited for millennia, a wall of ice that forced patience, improvisation, and a shift toward the coast, a shoreline now sunk beneath the Pacific, hiding whatever record it once held. Footprints of children running past mammoths at the coldest, harshest peak of the entire Ice Age, thousands of years before anyone thought people could have been there at all. A genetic story of rapid, branching expansion, not a single file of travelers, but an explosion of human life across two continents, echoing forward into the living nations of today. And an argument still unresolved in places, still being fought over new sediment samples in 2026, about exactly how early and by which paths all of it began. Most of that road is gone now, drowned, reshaped, buried under water that keeps rising even as we tell this story. What we have instead are fragments. A footprint here, a genome there, a village name passed down through thousands of years of memory in a language older than any of the sites archaeologists have dated. And maybe that absence is itself the most honest lesson this investigation offers. We tend to think of history as something written down, carved, or built to last, pyramids, monuments, inscriptions. But the deepest human history on this continent was written in mud, in ice, in the slow chemistry of bone, pollen, and buried quartz, on a landscape that was never designed to preserve it and mostly didn't. Nearly every fact in this story survived by accident. A lake bed that happened to dry into gypsum instead of washing away. A river valley in Idaho that happened to stay stable for 16,000 years. A patch of Siberian permafrost that happened to freeze mammoth ivory tools instead of rotting them. We are not looking at the whole journey. We are looking at whatever 20,000 years of wind, water, and ice chose to spare. Maybe that's the real shape of this story then? Not a single triumphant crossing from one empty world into another, but thousands of years of people finding a way through ice, along a coast the ocean has since erased, into a world that was never empty to begin with, and was never truly lost, because their descendants are still here on this continent to tell us where to look next. The next footprint, the next genome, the next contested date in a Chilean sediment layer is probably already out there, waiting to be found. The map of how we got here is still being drawn. It always was.